The rhythmic shriek of the assembly line suddenly snapped into a wet, sickening crunch that didn't sound like metal on metal. Somewhere in the sprawling darkness of the Ellis plant, a high-pitched scream was cut short by the roar of heavy machinery that refused to stop. Marjorie lunged for the emergency lever, her boots sliding through a fresh, dark pool of hydraulic fluid that smelled more like iron than oil. As she slammed her weight against the controls, the senior supervisor's hand clamped onto her wrist like a vice, his face inches from hers, eyes wild with a desperate, silent warning. The gears groaned, but didn't die. The line kept moving, dragging something mangled into the shadows of the secondary press. Down in the archives, a flashlight beam flickered across a stack of invoices where Marjorie's own signature stared back at her. Ink she never laid, certifying steel she knew would fail. Outside, the town of Gray River watched the factory smoke with the hunger of a dying animal, while the locks on Marjorie's office clicked shut from the outside. She wasn't just looking at a mechanical failure anymore. She was looking at a city that was willing to bury its own to keep the lights on. The foreman's whistle shrieked through the din of the assembly line, sharp as a rusted nail dragged across glass. Marjorie didn't flinch. She kept her fingers pressed against the pulsating throat of the hydraulic press, counting the uneven stutters in its rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Before the machine coughed out another warped chassis. The air smelled of burnt oil and something sharper, like copper pennies left too long in a pocket. She wiped her sleeve across her forehead, leaving a smudge of grease above her eyebrow. "You're gonna burn out the seals if you don't ease up," called Rick from the control booth, his voice crackling through the intercom. He leaned against the glass, arms crossed, the neon glow of the dashboard painting his face in sickly green. "Boss says we're on a tight schedule, but nothing," Marjorie cut in, not looking up. She yanked the release lever, and the press groaned, its pistons shuddering like an old man's hands. Tight schedule won't mean a damn if this thing seizes mid-shift. She crouched, running her thumb along the base plate. The metal was hot enough to blister skin, the seams packed with blackened grime. "See this?" She held up a flake of rust between her fingers. "That's not wear, that's neglect. Neglect." Rick exhaled through his nose, the sound lost in the clatter of conveyor belts. "You're the one who signed off on the last inspection." Marjorie's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the clipboard hanging from a hook, the pages stiff with dried hydraulic fluid. The numbers blurred for a second. Too many hours, too little maintenance, too many promises made to men in suits who'd never set foot on the floor. She flipped to the last page, where her own handwriting scrawled across the margin. "Replace gaskets by Friday or risk total failure." The date was circled in red, the ink smudged where her palm had pressed too hard. Somewhere in the rafters, a pipe dripped. The sound was steady, relentless, like a clock. She moved away from the press, her work boots heavy on the oil-slicked concrete. The vibrations of the factory floor traveled up through her soles, a feverish trembling that felt less like industry and more like a terminal illness. She reached out, running a gloved palm along the main housing of the primary stamping unit. The metal thrummed with a frantic, irregular pulse. It was too hot. Far too hot. Peering through the protective cage with her flashlight, she saw the truth of it. The guide rails were choked with steel shavings, the lubrication dried to a blackened crust. The manometers on the side of the unit didn't just hover in the red. They twitched in a rhythmic, desperate spasm. Marjorie pulled her marker from its pocket and slashed a heavy, bleeding crimson circle around the delivery date on the master schedule. Detroit was waiting. The contract was the only thing keeping the lights on in Gray River, a city that had forgotten what the sun looked like through the permanent shroud of industrial smog. She scribbled a note in her logbook, her handwriting sharp and jagged. Critical wear on assembly nodes. Catastrophe imminent. Imminent. The warning went unheeded. The factory didn't care for her notes, and the machines didn't care for her concern. A sound like a gunshot, but wetter, heavier, shattered the routine roar of the fourth line. Marjorie spun around just as a scream tore through the air, thin and high, a sound that didn't belong in a place of cold iron. A mechanical gripper on the main arm had suffered a catastrophic hydraulic failure, its steel jaw twitching in a violent, uncontrolled spasm. In its grip was the arm of Billy, a kid barely 20, whose face had drained of all color until it matched the pale, sickly white of the overhead fluorescence. Blood began to trickle, then flow, down the steel chute, a vivid, terrifying red against the gray. Marjorie didn't think. She lunged toward the control station, her shoulders slamming into a rack of wrenches that scattered across the floor like shrapnel. She hit the emergency stop with the heel of her hand. The massive flywheel above them began the long, agonizing process of slowing down, its deceleration accompanied by a dying wail that smelled of scorched copper and ozone. Silence didn't follow. Only the sound of Billy's ragged breathing and the steady drip-drip of fluid onto the floor. His fingers were inches from the crushing gears, trembling, slick with the life leaving him. "Don't move, Billy. Stay still." "Still," she whispered, her voice a low, rhythmic tether. But the silence was a lie. It was a temporary reprieve. Miller, the senior shift lead, was already there, his face a mask of sweating, panicked authority. He didn't look at Billy's arm. He looked at the stopped line. He looked at the clock. His hand reached for the override, his fingers hovering over the green start button. Marjorie stepped between him and the console, her back against the emergency lever. Her hands gripped the locking bar so hard the silver bracelet on her wrist clicked against the steel. "He's still caught, Miller. Look at the cable. The insulation is gone. It's a death trap." "Trap," she said, her words coming out in a single, breathless rush. "Move, Ellis," Miller growled, his face reddening under the hum of the lights. "We're behind. Detroit doesn't care about a pinched arm. They care about the quota. Move or I'll move you." He shoved her. It wasn't a hard blow, but it was enough to send her stumbling toward the blood-slicked floor. Before she could regain her footing, the green light flickered to life. The motor groaned, the belts shivered, and the relentless, unfeeling march of the conveyor resumed. The workers around them, men Marjorie had known for 20 years, lowered their heads. They looked at their boots, at their stations, at anything but the boy being carried toward the infirmary, or the woman standing in the middle of the aisle with grease on her face and fire in her eyes. The air in the director's office was different. It didn't vibrate with the machines. It sat heavy and still, thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the kind of quiet that only money can buy. Arthur Waits sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of oak, watching the smoke from his cigar curl toward the ceiling. He didn't look at the report Marjorie had placed before him. He looked at her. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked around the desk. He leaned in close, so close she could smell the cognac on his breath, a sharp contrast to the burnt metal reality of the floor below. "A tragic accident, Marjorie," Waits said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "A lapse in judgment by a junior employee. That's what the insurance company needs to hear. That's what Detroit needs to hear." "The machine failed, Arthur. The sensors were bypassed. I have the logs." "Logs," she countered, her voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet level. Waits didn't argue. He simply took the report, his fingers steady, and began to tear it. The sound of the paper rending was the loudest thing in the room. We are the heart of this town. If the heart stops, everyone dies. You want to be the one to tell 3,000 families they're out on the street because you wanted to be right about a faulty wire? He dropped the scraps into the wastebasket. Rewrite the protocol. It was operator error. Do it by morning. She left the office feeling as though the walls were closing in, a sensation that only intensified when she reached the small, cramped laboratory she called her own. She wasn't alone. Thomas Vance, the mayor of Gray River, was standing by the window, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky and the distant, glowing chimneys of the plant. He didn't turn when she entered. He just gestured toward the town below, the boarded-up storefronts, the sagging porches, the ghosts of a prosperity that had died 10 years ago. "I remember when this place was green, Marjorie," Vance said softly. He turned, placing a heavy paternal hand on her shoulder. His palm was warm, but the grip felt like a shackle. "This contract, it's the rain after a decade of drought. If you find a reason to stop it, you aren't just a whistleblower. You're the one who burns the crops." He looked at her with eyes that were tired, desperate, and implicitly threatening. He didn't need to yell. The weight of the dying city did the yelling for him. But Marjorie Ellis was a woman of facts. Facts didn't care about the economy, and they didn't care about the mayor's nostalgia. At midnight, the factory was a different beast, a sleeping giant that still breathed through hissing steam pipes and clicking relays. Marjorie slipped through the shadows of the basement archives, the beam of her flashlight a lonely needle of light in the darkness. The smell of damp paper and ancient dust filled her lungs. She pulled a heavy ledger from the shelf, the spine cracking in the silence. She began to cross-reference. The blueprints called for grade A high-tensile steel for the brake assembly nodes. She pulled the recent procurement receipts, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. The numbers didn't match. Not even close. The density figures she'd recorded from the floor samples were 30% lower than the specifications. "Cheap scrap," she whispered to the empty room. "They're using scrap. Scrap." She turned the page and felt her heart skip a beat. The invoices were from a shell company, a logistics firm that didn't exist 3 months ago. And the signatures, the ones certifying the quality of the incoming raw materials, were her own, or a clumsy imitation of them. She traced the line where the ink had bled, a clear sign of a lightbox forgery. She wasn't just being ignored. She was being framed. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, making the air in the archive feel thin and cold. They hadn't just cut corners. They'd built a system of failure and put her name on the foundation. A sudden, blinding flare of light shattered the darkness. Marjorie gasped, dropping the ledger. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, echoing through the stacks. "A bit late for light reading, isn't it, Ellis?" Sloan, the head of security, stood in the doorway. He was flanked by 2 men whose shadows stretched across the floor like predatory birds. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked forward, his boots rhythmic and heavy on the concrete. He kicked the ledger aside and stepped into her personal space, his face a mask of professional indifference. "This area is restricted after hours. Safety protocol." "Protocol," he said, a mocking echo of her own speech pattern. He reached out and snatched the flashlight from her hand. "You're done here. Consider yourself on administrative leave, effective immediately." He didn't escort her out. He pushed her. He led her toward the exit, the heavy steel door of the archive slamming shut behind them with a finality that sounded like a tomb closing. The morning didn't bring relief. It brought a summons to the Human Resources office, where Waits was already waiting, flanked by a man in a sharp, charcoal gray suit, who looked like he'd been born in a courtroom. There were no pleasantries. "Industrial espionage, Marjorie," Waite said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Accessing proprietary files without authorization, attempting to sabotage a federal contract." "I was checking the specs, Arthur. You're using substandard alloy. It's a fraud." "Fraud," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The lawyer leaned forward. "We have your signature on the intake forms, Miss Ellis. If you go to the press, we'll see you in a federal prison before the first headline hits the stands. Sign the non-disclosure, take the severance, walk away." "No." She didn't wait for them to respond. She stood up and walked out, her head held high even as her world began to crumble. The parking lot was a sea of gray asphalt and rust-eaten trucks. Marjorie reached her car, her breath hitching in her chest. As she pulled out of the gate, a black sedan, windows tinted to the color of midnight, slid into the lane behind her. It didn't pass. It didn't fall back. It stayed exactly 2 car lengths behind, a silent, predatory shadow. She turned onto a side street. The sedan followed. She accelerated, her hands gripping the wheel until her knuckles turned white. The roar of the other car's engine grew louder, a low-frequency growl that she felt in her teeth. She was being hunted in her own town by the very people she was trying to protect. When she reached her house, she didn't feel safe. She felt trapped. She tried to log into her home computer to access the cloud backups of her private tests, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. Access denied. Account suspended. They were erasing her. Every file, every email, every digital footprint she'd left at the plant was being systematically deleted. She sat in the dark of her living room, watching the headlights of the black sedan as it parked across the street, the engine idling like a purring beast. She was a ghost in a city of the living, and the living wanted her gone. The window of the fire escape groaned, a high-pitched protest of rusted hinges that sounded like a scream in the stagnant air of the factory's back alley. Marjorie squeezed through the narrow opening, the jagged edge of the frame catching her sleeve and tearing the fabric. She didn't care. She dropped onto the floor of the darkened lab, her boots landing silently on the rubber matting. The room smelled of ozone and the metallic tang of cold steel. She moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent half her life in this square footage. She grabbed a fragment of a brake housing from the reject bin, a piece she knew had come from the new shipment, and secured it in the heavy industrial vise. The drill bit screamed as it bit into the metal. Usually grade A steel threw off sparks like a 4th of July sparkler, bright, white, and energetic. This metal didn't spark. It groaned. It threw off dull, orange flakes of heat and a foul-smelling gray dust. "Cast iron," she hissed, her voice a jagged rasp in the dark. "They're using cast iron for high-stress nodes. Murder." She uncapped a vial of nitric acid and let a single drop fall onto the freshly drilled surface. The reaction was instantaneous. Instead of the slow, clean etch of hardened steel, the metal began to boil. A thick, brownish foam bubbled up, stinking of sulfur and rot. The acid wasn't just cleaning the surface. It was eating the metal alive, revealing a porous, honeycomb structure that would shatter like glass under the weight of a loaded truck. "Marjorie, stop, just stop." The voice came from the shadows by the chemical lockers. She didn't jump. She'd expected him. Charlie stepped into the weak circle of light from her desk lamp. He looked older than he had yesterday. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands, usually so steady with a wrench, were trembling as he gripped a half-empty bottle of cheap rye. "You shouldn't be here, Marge," he said, his voice thick. Sloane's men are looking for you. Look at this, Charlie, she said, gesturing to the bubbling metal. You signed off on this. You knew. Knew. Charlie didn't look. He slumped into a chair, the bottle clinking against the metal table. We were 6 weeks from total liquidation. 6 weeks, Marjorie. The bank was coming for the titles. The city was going to cut the power to the whole damn town. He looked up, a single tear carving a clean path through the grease on his cheek. I didn't have a choice. I used the cheaper alloy to balance the books. It was that or the end of everything. It's the end of the people in those cars, Charlie. If these nodes snap on a highway, it's a massacre. Massacre. Charlie lunged forward, grabbing her arm. His grip was desperate, pleading. Think about the families on 5th Street, Marge. Think about Billy. If the contract fails, there's no money for his surgery. There's no money for anyone. We just need to get through the first shipment. We'll fix the line for the second batch, I swear. Just let this one go. His breath smelled of stale booze and despair. Marjorie looked at him. The man who had taught her how to read a micrometer, the man who had been her father's best friend, and saw a stranger. I can't, she said. The air in the lab shifted. The pleading in Charlie's eyes died, replaced by a cold, hard flick of survival. He didn't let go of her arm. He squeezed tighter. Then you're a fool, he whispered. Before she could pull away, the door to the lab was kicked open. Sloane's men didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions. One of them grabbed the strap of Marjorie's bag, the leather groaning before the stitching gave way with a sickening pop. They didn't hit her, but they didn't have to. They lifted her off the floor, her feet dangling, and dragged her toward the service elevator. She looked back at Charlie. He had turned away, his head in his hands, the bottle of rye his only companion. They threw her into the back of the black sedan, the door locking with a heavy, electronic thud. The car moved fast, bouncing over the broken pavement of the industrial district until it reached the skeletal remains of the old warehouse at the edge of the property. The interior of the warehouse was a cathedral of rot. Shafts of moonlight pierced the holes in the corrugated roof, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. The men dragged her out of the car and shoved her into the cab of a derelict truck parked in the center of the floor. "Stay put, Ellis," one of them said, his voice a low rumble. "We're just going to let you cool off until the inspectors leave tomorrow." They slammed the truck door. She heard the heavy clack of a chain being wound through the door handles on the outside. Then, the sound of a heavy engine. A massive Mack truck, a relic from the plant's glory days, began to back up, its exhaust belching black smoke. It stopped inches from the cab of her truck, its massive steel bumper acting as a barricade. She was in a cage within a cage. The warehouse grew silent, save for the ticking of the cooling engines and the distant, lonely howl of a dog. Marjorie sat on the cracked vinyl seat, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and mouse droppings. She wasn't alone. She could hear them outside, the rhythmic click-click of claws on concrete. Sloane's Dobermans. They weren't barking, they were pacing, their low, guttural growls vibrating through the thin metal of the truck door. Every few minutes, a shadow would pass the window. A man with a rifle, his silhouette a sharp, jagged reminder of her situation. Hours bled into each other. The heat in the cab became stifling, a humid, claustrophobic weight that made her head swim. She leaned her forehead against the glass, watching the moon crawl across the sky. The warehouse door creaked open. A figure silhouetted against the gray pre-dawn light walked toward the truck. It was Charlie. He climbed onto the running board, his face appearing in the window like a ghost. "Last chance, Marge," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. "Tell me where the backups are. Tell me you'll keep quiet and I'll let you out. We can go back to how things were. You're a jailer now, Charlie? Jailer?" She didn't look at him. "I'm a savior," he hissed, slamming his fist against the door. "I'm saving this town from people like you who think a moral victory is worth 1,000 starving kids." He leaned in closer, his eyes wild. "I remember when your dad died. I remember how you cried. You think he'd want this? You think he'd want you to destroy his legacy for the sake of a few faulty parts? He'd want the truth, Charlie. He always said the truth is the only thing that doesn't rust." Rust. Charlie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He reached into the cab through the small vent window, his hand fumbling for her shoulder. It was a gesture of mock affection, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between them. "I'm sorry, Marge," he whispered. As he reached in, his jacket bunched up. Marjorie saw it, the glint of silver. The keys to the warehouse and the truck chains were hanging from a clip on his belt. She didn't hesitate. As he leaned in to pull her into a forced embrace, her fingers moved with the precision of a master mechanic. She felt the cold metal of the key ring, the sharp edge of the warehouse key. With a flick of her wrist, she unclipped it, sliding it into the cuff of her sleeve just as he pulled away. "Think about it," he said, stepping down. "I'll be back in an hour, if you haven't changed your mind by then." Sloane takes over. She watched him walk away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited until the warehouse door clicked shut, until the sound of his footsteps faded. She moved fast. She used a heavy screwdriver she found under the seat to pry at the window seal, creating just enough space to slide her arm through. The chain was heavy, cold, and smelled of salt. She fumbled with the lock, her fingers numb, the key slipping twice before it finally bit. The lock turned. The chain fell away with a heavy, metallic clatter that sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. She didn't go for the door. She knew the dogs were waiting. Instead, she climbed through the back window of the cab, dropping into the bed of the truck and then onto the oil-stained floor. She stayed low, moving between the shadows of the rusted machinery. She could hear the dogs now, a frantic, high-pitched barking from the other side of the Mack truck. They'd heard the chain. Marjorie didn't look back. She found a loose panel in the corrugated steel wall, a gap she'd noticed earlier. She squeezed through, the metal tearing at her skin, and tumbled out into the wet, gray grass of the perimeter. She ran. She didn't head for the road. She headed for the residential district, her lungs burning, her heart a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated terror. The town was waking up. She saw Mr. Hendricks, her neighbor for 20 years, out on his porch with a cup of coffee. She slowed down, her hand reaching out for the fence. "Mr. Hendricks, please, I need to use your phone." Phone. The old man didn't move. He looked at her torn clothes, her grease-stained face, her desperate eyes, and he spat on the ground. "Get lost, Ellis," he rasped. "We heard what you're trying to do. You want to kill this town? Do it somewhere else." She backed away, the rejection stinging worse than the acid in the lab. She turned the corner, only to see the town's loudspeaker system crackle to life. It was Waits's voice, booming over the empty streets, a digital god announcing the new era of prosperity. "And we must remain vigilant against those who would sabotage our future," the voice echoed. "Provocators, liars, people who would see your children go hungry for their own selfish gains." The people on the sidewalk stopped. They looked at her, not with curiosity, but with a cold, simmering resentment. She was the monster in their fairy tale. She reached her apartment building, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her keys. The front door was already open. The lock had been sheared off, the wood splintered. She stepped inside. The apartment was a ruin. Her books were shredded, her clothes strewn across the floor, her father's old chair overturned. And there, on the wall, written in the same brownish-red paint they used for the factory chassis, "Leave or die." The smell of the paint was fresh. They were still there, or they'd just left. Marjorie didn't cry. She didn't have time. She went to the kitchen, reached under the sink, and pulled out the small, waterproof case she'd hidden behind the pipes weeks ago. Inside was the one thing they hadn't found: the physical backup of the original alloy tests. She tucked it into her waistband, her jaw set, her eyes cold. The factory whistle blew in the distance. The inspectors were arriving. The clock was at 0. The morning of the inspection arrived not with a sunrise, but with a thickening of the gray soup that passed for air in Gray River. Marjorie crouched behind a stack of rusted pallets near the south gate, her breath hitching every time a security patrol passed. The factory was draped in lies. Huge scarlet banners hung from the rafters, their fabric clean and bright, a jarring contrast to the crumbling concrete they covered. She watched from the shadows as workers in fresh, unsoiled coveralls scurried about, slapping coats of machinery-green paint over the rusted frames of the secondary line. They weren't fixing the machines. They were burying the rot. The smell of fresh enamel was nauseating, thick enough to mask the scent of the scorched insulation and the failing bearings. She moved toward the administrative wing, her heart a frantic hammer. She needed her files. She needed the physical evidence she'd stashed in the small floor safe in the quality control sub-office. The door to the sub-office was hanging open, the frame splintered. Marjorie stepped inside, her boots crunching on broken glass. The room had been gutted. Her desk was overturned, the monitors smashed, the filing cabinets emptied, and their contents burned in a metal trash can that still smoldered in the corner. She knelt by the safe. The heavy steel door had been torched open, the edges of the metal melted into jagged, blackened teeth. It was empty. Every scrap of paper, every hard drive, every shred of proof she'd spent months gathering was gone. Looking for these? Marjorie spun around. Sloan stood in the doorway, a thick manila folder in his hand. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He tossed the folder onto the smoldering pile in the trash can. The flames leapt up, hungrily devouring the charts and the chemical analyses. "You're persistent, Ellis. I'll give you that," Sloan said, stepping into the room. "But persistence without power is just a slow way to commit suicide." He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have to. He just stood there, a wall of meat and authority, blocking the only exit. "The town hates you, Marjorie. The boss wants you gone. And the inspectors. They're having lunch with the mayor right now. They aren't going to listen to a disgruntled ex-employee with no data." Marjorie backed toward the window, her hand brushing against a heavy glass paperweight on the edge of the overturned desk. "The data is in the cars, Sloan. When they crash, the truth will come out. Out." Sloan laughed, a dry rattling sound. "By then, the checks will have cleared. And you? You'll be long gone." He moved toward her, his hand reaching out. Marjorie didn't think. She grabbed the paperweight and hurled it. It caught him on the shoulder, a glancing blow, but it was enough to make him stumble. She lunged past him, her shoulder slamming into his chest, and burst into the hallway. She ran toward the parking lot, her lungs screaming. She needed to get away, to find a phone, to call anyone outside this dying town. She reached her car and stopped dead. Every window had been shattered. The tires were slashed, the rubber hanging in limp, black ribbons. But it was the hood that stopped her heart. A gallon of black, used motor oil had been poured over the engine, and scratched into the paint with a jagged tool was a single word: traitor. She touched the oil. It was thick, smelling of 1,000 miles of failure. The wind picked up, whistling through the broken glass of her windshield, a sound like a mocking laugh. She was trapped. "Marjorie, over here." She turned. It was James, one of the younger guys from the floor. He was standing by the entrance to the cafeteria, beckoning her with a frantic hand. She ran to him, hope flickering for a brief, foolish second. As she stepped inside, the hope died. The cafeteria was full. Hundreds of workers, men she'd shared coffee with for decades, stood in a loose circle. They didn't move. They just watched. Sloan walked in behind her, his face dark with a fresh bruise. He didn't say a word. He just nodded to a group of men by the door. They moved in. They didn't hit her, but their grip was iron. They pinned her arms to her sides, the smell of their sweat and grease-stained jackets filling her nose. "We're a family here, Marjorie," one of them whispered in her ear. It was Bill, the union rep. "And family doesn't betray family. You're making things hard for everyone. Very hard. Hard. I'm trying to save your lives, Bill. The breaks are fake. Fake." Bill just shook his head. "The only thing that's fake is your loyalty. Sloan says you've been paid off by the guys in Cincinnati to sink the deal. Is that true? Is it?" The crowd surged forward, a wall of angry, desperate faces. Marjorie felt the heat of their breath, the weight of their collective fear turning into rage. "I'm not leaving, Marjorie," a voice said from the back. The crowd parted. Charlie walked forward. He looked sober now, and his eyes were as cold as the steel he forged. "Give me the backup, Marge. The one you took from the truck. Give it to me and I'll make sure you get out of town in one piece. If you don't, I can't promise what these guys will do." Marjorie looked at him. She looked at the men holding her. She felt the small, hard shape of the backup drive against her hip. No. The word was small, but in the silence of the cafeteria, it sounded like a gunshot. Charlie sighed. He looked at Sloan. "Take her to the lab. We'll find it ourselves." They dragged her through the factory, past the silent machines and the fresh paint. The lab was a wreck, but the testing equipment was still there. They threw her into a chair and began to tear at her clothes, searching for the drive. She fought. She bit. She kicked. She screamed until her throat was raw. "Found it!" Sloan yelled, pulling the small waterproof case from her waistband. He handed it to Charlie. Charlie looked at it, his face unreadable. He walked over to the main terminal and plugged it in. "Delete it, Charlie," Sloan said. "All of it." Charlie's fingers hovered over the keys. He looked at the screen, at the graphs showing the catastrophic failure points, the chemical signatures of the scrap metal, the proof of the forgery. "Charlie, don't. Don't," Marjorie whispered. The room was silent, save for the hum of the computers and the distant, rhythmic thud of the main press. Charlie looked at Marjorie. Then he looked at Sloan. He hit a button. Formatting drive. 10%, 20%. Marjorie felt the last of her strength leave her. She slumped in the chair, her eyes fixed on the screen as her life's work, her father's legacy, and the truth itself were dissolved into digital nothingness. "It's done," Charlie said, his voice hollow. Sloan nodded. "Get her out of here. Throw her in the holding cell in the basement. We'll deal with her after the signing." They dragged her away. But Marjorie didn't fight anymore. She watched Charlie as he stood by the terminal, his shadow long and jagged on the floor. He didn't look at her. The basement was a place of shadows and the smell of stagnant water. They threw her into a small, concrete room and locked the heavy steel door. Marjorie sat on the floor, the cold of the concrete seeping into her bones. She looked at her hands. They were covered in grease, blood, and the black oil from her car. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against something small and hard. A micro SD card. She'd swapped it. She'd put the real data on the card and left a dummy file on the main drive. She looked at the card, its gold contacts gleaming in the dim light. She wasn't done yet. But the door was locked. The guards were outside, and the signing was in less than an hour. She stood up, her jaw tightening. She looked at the ventilation grate high on the wall. It was small. It was narrow. It was choked with dust. She began to climb. The ventilation shaft was a horizontal coffin of galvanized steel, vibrating with the rhythmic, thundering heartbeat of the factory. Marjorie crawled on her stomach, her elbows raw and bleeding, the taste of 50 years of industrial dust thick in her throat. Every few feet, a seam in the metal would snag her clothes. A sharp, metallic tug that felt like a hand trying to pull her back into the darkness. She could hear them below. The muffled voices of Sloane's guards, the distant, celebratory clink of glassware in the administrative wing. The signing was happening. The lie was being made official. She reached a junction and paused, her ear pressed against the cold metal. "Everything's ready," a voice echoed up the duct. It was Charlie. He sounded tired, his words dragging as if through mud. "The inspectors are in the conference room. Waits is about to give his speech." "And the woman?" That was Sloane. "Still in the hole. We'll move her tonight. Just get the damn papers signed, Sloane. I want this over. Over." Marjorie's fingers tightened on the small plastic casing of the micro SD card. She pushed forward, her movements frantic now. She followed the sound of the voices, the air growing warmer, smelling of expensive coffee and the floral perfume of the mayor's secretary. She reached a grate overlooking the main conference room. It was a scene from a corporate brochure. Arthur Waits stood at the head of the long mahogany table, a golden pen in his hand. Opposite him sat the 3 inspectors from Detroit, their faces masks of professional neutrality. Mayor Vance stood by the window, a glass of champagne already in his hand, his face glowing with a triumphant, sickly light. "A new chapter for Gray River," Waits was saying, his voice smooth and resonant. "A partnership built on quality, trust, and the hard work of our citizens." He leaned over the contract. The pen hovered over the signature line. Marjorie didn't wait. She kicked the grate. It didn't budge. The screws were rusted tight. She kicked again, her heels slamming into the metal with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. Below, the room went silent. Every head turned toward the ceiling. "What the hell was that?" one of the inspectors asked. Marjorie didn't answer. She threw her entire weight against the grate. The metal groaned, the screws shrieking as they were torn from the plaster. She fell. She hit the conference table with a bone-jarring thud, scattering crystal glasses and hors d'oeuvres. She rolled, her boots leaving streaks of basement grime on the polished wood, and scrambled to her feet. She looked like a ghost from the machine, covered in soot, her clothes torn, her face a mask of sweat and blood. "Marjorie!" Waits hissed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Security! Get her out of here!" Sloane and 2 guards burst through the door, but the lead inspector stood up, his hand raised. "Wait," the man said. He looked at Marjorie, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "Miss Ellis, I presume? The one we were told had suffered a nervous breakdown? I have the data," Marjorie gasped, her voice a ragged rasp. She held up the micro SD card. "The real data, not the fake logs they showed you. The alloy is scrap. The tests were forged. Forged." "She's lying," Vance shouted, stepping forward. "She's been paid by the competitors. She's trying to destroy us." Marjorie ignored him. She looked at the inspector. "There's a laptop on the sideboard. Plug it in. Look at the high-stress failure videos. Look at the chemical signatures. If I'm lying, let Sloan take me. If I'm not, you're about to put 10,000 death traps on the road." The room was a vacuum of tension. Sloan took a step toward her, his hand reaching for his belt. "Stay back, Sloan," the inspector said. He took the card from Marjorie's hand. He walked to the laptop. The room was silent, save for the frantic, rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the keyboard. A video began to play. It was the test Marjorie had run in secret. On the screen, the brake node glowed a sickly orange before shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The data overlay showed the pressure, barely half of the required safety threshold. The inspector scrolled through the files. The chemical analysis of the grade A steel appeared, showing the high carbon content of cheap, brittle cast iron. He turned to Waits. His face was no longer neutral. It was a mask of cold, professional fury. "This is a criminal conspiracy, Mr. Waits," the inspector said. I can explain," Waits stammered, his face draining of color. "The margins. We were trying to save the town." "You were trying to save your bonuses," the inspector snapped. He turned to his colleagues. "The contract is null and void. Notify the Department of Justice. Now." The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating weight that seemed to press the very air out of the room. Marjorie looked at Charlie. He was standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Charlie," she whispered. He didn't look up. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. Not the factory whistle, but the sharp, urgent cry of the state police. The room dissolved into chaos. Sloan tried to bolt, but the guards were already being intercepted by the inspector's own security team. Waits slumped into his chair, the golden pen falling from his hand and rolling across the floor. Marjorie walked out of the room. She didn't stay to see the handcuffs or the flashbulbs of the reporters who were already swarming the gates. She walked through the factory. The machines were silent now. The workers stood by their stations, their faces pale, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and a dawning, terrible realization. The heart of Gray River had stopped. She walked out of the main gate and sat on the curb. The air was cold, the sky a bruised, heavy purple. She looked at her hands. They were still shaking. A shadow fell over her. It was James. He sat down beside her, his head in his hands. "What now, Marge?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Now we tell the truth," she said. "The whole truth. Truth. The town is dead, isn't it?" Marjorie looked at the silent chimneys, the boarded-up windows, the ghosts of the prosperity that had been built on a foundation of lies. "The town was already dead, James. We were just pretending it was breathing." She stood up and began to walk. She didn't head for her apartment. She headed for the river, the dark, sluggish water that had seen the rise and fall of everything in this valley. She took the silver bracelet from her wrist and looked at it. It was old, the metal worn smooth by years of nervous ticking. She threw it into the water. She didn't feel better. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who had finally stopped holding her breath. The factory whistle blew one last time, a long, mournful wail that echoed through the hills before fading into the cold, silent air. Marjorie Ellis kept walking. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. The truth was behind her, and for the first time in 43 years, the path ahead was clear. Clear. The weeks that followed were a slow-motion collapse. The factory didn't just close, it was dismantled, its pride stripped away by federal investigators and bankruptcy lawyers. The great chimneys, once the source of the town's lifeblood, stood cold and silent, like the headstones of a forgotten era. Marjorie stayed in her apartment. She didn't have anywhere else to go. The threats had stopped, replaced by a silence that was far more cutting. People didn't yell at her anymore. They simply looked through her, as if she were a ghost haunting the ruins of their lives. She sat on her porch every evening, watching the sunset bleed over the empty parking lots. The black sedan was gone. Sloan was in a federal holding cell. Waits was awaiting trial. And Charlie, she'd seen him once, being led out of the courthouse. He looked small. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the weight of the world was too much for one person to carry, especially when that person was standing on a lie. He looked at her. Just for a second. There was no anger in his eyes, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. A shadow fell across the porch. It was Mayor Vance. He looked older, his suits no longer fitting his shrinking frame. He didn't sit down. "The supermarket is closing next week, Marjorie," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The school board is talking about consolidation. The young people, they're leaving. Everyone who can leave is leaving. They have to, Thomas. There's nothing left here. Nothing." "You did this," he said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man reciting a fact. "You broke the only thing we had. I didn't break it. It was already broken. I just stopped the pretending." Pretending. Vance looked at the empty street. Was it worth it? The truth? Was it worth the death of a town? Marjorie looked at him, her gray eyes as clear and cold as the river. Ask the families of the people who didn't die in those cars. Ask them if it was worth it. Vance didn't answer. He turned and walked away, his cane tapping a lonely, irregular rhythm on the cracked pavement. Marjorie stood up and went inside. She began to pack. Not much, just her clothes, her father's old tools, a few books. She picked up a photograph of her father, standing in front of the factory gates in 1975. He was smiling, his arm around a young, laughing Charlie. She tucked it into her bag. She walked out of the apartment and locked the door. She didn't leave the key. There was no one to give it to. She walked to the bus station. The waiting room was empty, the air smelling of stale cigarettes and floor wax. The bus arrived, a heavy, diesel-breathing beast that seemed too large for the empty streets. Marjorie climbed aboard and took a seat in the back. As the bus pulled out of the station, she looked out the window. The factory was a dark silhouette against the rising moon. The Ellis sign was missing the E, the remaining letters glowing a dim, flickering orange. She watched until the town was gone, replaced by the dark, rolling hills of the Ohio Valley. She leaned her head against the window, the vibration of the engine, a steady, honest hum. She wasn't sure where she was going, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the dark. She closed her eyes. "The truth," she whispered to the empty bus. "The truth is the only thing that doesn't rust." Rust. The bus drove on, its headlights cutting a twin path through the night, leaving the ghosts of Gray River far behind in the rearview mirror. The road was long. The road was uncertain. But the road was real. Real.